your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
Let me just touch base on something real quick. We've sent out a couple of emails this week, just trying to get some information out there that we need to share with our church family. Monday, sent out an email about the concert and so forth, and how to secure tickets through Eventbrite and so forth. And so just to kind of clarify, because there was a thing came up with somebody about, well, because in there in the instructions there were two places where it says when you go to this page, do not click on this, for those of you that have seen it. And I didn't explain why. I just kind of figured, just follow the instructions. But here's the reason why, if anybody wants to know or you happen to ask. It's to keep you from getting hassled with Eventbrite wanting you to set up an account with them. That's the whole reason for it, because it takes you in a whole different direction. So it's just kind of like, sometimes you just need to follow directions and don't ask why, right? All right, keep it simple. But if anybody happens to ask, or if you're wondering why, well, that's the reason why. So, all right, John chapter number 18. We're making our way through the Gospel of John, getting close to the conclusion of the Gospel of John, not too much further to go with it. Talking to Randy today. One of the things y'all going to be praying for me, and maybe you might have some ideas and stuff, but I'm kind of thinking about and praying about where we go when we finish with the Gospel of John. One of the things I'm really leaning towards, and I've mentioned this several times, in recent months, I've gotten back into reading out of the Old Testament. And most of my preaching and everything I've done over the years has been predominantly out of the New Testament. And here back several months ago, the Lord just impressed upon me, you kind of been ignoring me over here on the other side. So I thought, okay, I need to spend some time going back and reading the Old Testament and reading the historical books. And I have just absolutely just loved it, because, it is just loaded. So I'm really debating about, what to maybe teach out of that and where, but I definitely feel led to want to go and do something in the Old Testament. I'm almost tempted to go back and just start with Joshua and work through Judges, and then would go to 1st and 2nd Samuel and the Kings. I'm in 1st Chronicles right now, and like I said, I've just been loving it, and seeing things I've read before, but then seeing new things that I haven't seen in the past. So anyway, just be praying for me as we think about where we're going to go with our study on Wednesday evenings. John chapter 18, we are getting closer to the end, as we would say, of the road that Jesus was walking, which ultimately will lead to the cross. So here we get to matters pertaining to the Garden of Gethsemane and his arrest and betrayal and that sort of thing. So we'll get into that tonight. We're not going to finish John 18. We'll have to come back to it next week, but we're going to start. And so the first thing we want to talk about this evening is, in your outline, Jesus prays in the garden. Now, John doesn't give us as much detail as the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we're going to deal with that. But verse 1 simply says this, that when Jesus had spoken these words, remember he had given the upper room discourse, started in the upper room. They leave, they're making their way towards the east of Jerusalem, moving down through the Kidron Valley, moving towards the Kidron Brook, which eventually brings them up the other side, the Mount of Olives, and eventually to the Garden of Gethsemane. But when Jesus had finished with his prayer, obviously his high priestly prayer that we looked at last week in John 17, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. So remember, as they descend the eastern side, as they descend from Jerusalem, that's where they would have gone through a vineyard. In John 15, abide in me, I am the vine, you are the branches, took place there. The remainder of the discourse, John 16, I've overcome the world, in me you have peace, and so forth, talking about the Holy Spirit and the work of the Spirit. Somewhere before they get to the brook Kidron is where Jesus stops and goes into his prayer that we looked at last week, his high priestly prayer. And then they cross the brook and they begin the ascent up the other side of the Mount of Olives, heading towards the Garden of Gethsemane. And so he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now, that's pretty much really all that John has to say about the Garden of Gethsemane and so forth. But I want us, because we are there, I think it's important that we go back and we actually be reminded, of what transpired there in the Garden of Gethsemane. So I'm going to be reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46, if you want to look there, because I want us to actually spend some time talking about Jesus' prayer in the garden. So we go to Matthew chapter 26, and beginning with verse number 36, we read, Jesus came with them, the disciples, to a place called Gethsemane. Now, so let me ask you a question. And most of you probably have studied this, and you may know the answer to this question. What does Gethsemane mean? The Garden of Gethsemane. Do you remember what it means? It means oil press. The place of the oil press, the garden where the oil press is located, there on the Mount of Olives. And it was a press in which they would take and they would harvest olives. They would put them there. That's where they extracted the oil from the olives for the olive oil. And so, to me, it's a place that is identified with pressure and with crushing. I just find that really fascinating, because and look at what the oil press did. It took the olives and it pressed the blood of the olives out of them, their oil. Jesus' blood, even here in the garden, we're going to see as we make our way through this, he is under such pressure, crushing pressure. So to me, it's just really interesting that this is where all of this transpires. And you've got this name, this place of the oil press, associated with pressure and with crushing and all those kinds of things. And so he goes to the place called Gethsemane, he and his disciples. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. So remember, those three men were the inner circle that Jesus had among him, among the disciples. They were the ones that were closest to Jesus. And of those three, John was the closest, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is the whole idea there. And then we read this. It says, so he takes Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Now, I just got through saying Gethsemane is associated with what? Pressure, crushing, okay? It's interesting when you go in here and you look at the words that Matthew uses in describing what Jesus is experiencing. I mean, he is experiencing overwhelming spiritual pressure in his life. The term that says he became deeply distressed, the term that says and he began to be sorrowful is the first statement. It is a word that can be translated as being grieved, saddened, but it has an emotional connotation to it. So Jesus emotionally was experiencing a grieving and a deep, deep sadness. So he's experiencing this stuff on an emotional level. Then you read the term says he was sorrowful and deeply distressed. And that word specifically speaks about mental distress. It speaks about to be filled with heaviness, with depression. Hey, listen, anybody, I don't know who among us here that's ever experienced depression to any significant experience, but I'm telling you something. If you've ever experienced deep depression to any extent, you have some sense of what that's talking about right there. And you have some sense of the emotional sadness and at the same time the mental distress that goes with it. Jesus was experiencing both of those there in the Garden of Gethsemane. All right? And obviously, at the heart of all this was that there were these spiritual realities and the spiritual conflict and the spiritual consequences that were to come out of all of this. Verse 38. Then he said to them, that is to Peter, James, and John, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful even to death. And this is a different word from the sorrowful that we saw just a moment ago. It's not the same word. It's translated by the same English word, but it's a different word in the original text. It means to be intensely sad, grieved all around, through and through. And so the way I read it is, it's almost like a term that's bringing the other two together. It's like combining the emotional and the mental and the spiritual distress and heaviness that Jesus is experiencing. It's overwhelming. It's crushing. Jesus is, we've talked about this, and we're going to see this in a moment. Jesus is going to talk about my hour. Okay, we've talked about that over and over again. Jesus, in his prayer last week, he talked to his Father about my hour and so forth. The hour's getting closer, and the closer the hour is getting, the greater the weight he is sensing. It's just getting there. And here's something, this is something, you have to think about this, okay? Why? This is Jesus. He's the one who said, I've overcome the world. My peace I give to you. And yet we see he gets here, even Jesus as a man was subject to all the crushing weight that was coming down upon him. And then he said to his disciples, stay here and watch with me. Be alert and pray with me. And I read that and I think, in this moment, think about this, in this critical moment that Jesus is facing, the thing that he wants most from his disciples is for them to pray with him and just their presence, their conscious presence with him. It would have been an encouragement to him. I think that's what he was asking for. It's what he wanted. Verse 39. He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And in that statement, I see a reflection of the struggle that all of us experience in our prayer life. And you know what that struggle is? What we want, what we request, and yet at the same time, the wrestle with saying yes to the Father's will. You see a reflection of that struggle in there. But Jesus says, "But nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Verse 40. Then he came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping, and said to them, "What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And I also want to go back, and one thing I missed, I wanted to talk about up here where Jesus said, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." So what do you think Jesus is talking about when he said, "Let this cup pass from me"? Is it the trial? Is it the mockery? Is it the betrayal? Is it the scourging? Is it the crucifixion? Is that what Jesus is including in the cup, or is it something else? Do what? Yeah. What does the Bible say about? What does the Bible say actually happened when the sins of the world were placed on Jesus? What happened to him? All right, the Father turned away. There was a separation. But I believe it's 2 Corinthians 5:19. One of the texts there in Paul's letter, he said that he who knew no sin became sin. Think about that. So we oftentimes talk about, our sins were laid upon Jesus, and that's true, but it actually goes even further than that. Paul says he was made sin. He became sin. In other words, he became the personification of all the collective sin of all humanity for all of time, and the collective wrath of God upon all that sin was laid on Jesus, and he took the brunt of it. I mean, honestly, you could say, like, people say, well, it's hell on earth. Let me tell you something. Jesus is the only one that's ever truly experienced hell on earth. Because all of the wrath and vengeance of God towards the heinousness of our sin was poured out on him while he was on the cross. And it was during that time that the Father turned away, and something happened that never had happened before, never will happen again, and there was an interruption in the fellowship, perfect fellowship, between the Father and the Son. And so we read verse 40. He comes to his disciples. He finds them sleeping. He says, can't you watch and pray lest you enter into temptation? The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Verse 42, he comes back again. And he went and prayed and said, oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass from me unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came and he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And it's somewhere about in this particular point in time where Luke makes the statement in chapter 24, verse 44, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. To me, that statement right there is just reinforces what I said earlier. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane, a place associated with pressure and crushing, and that's exactly what he was experiencing while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, was the overwhelming weight of it all coming down on Jesus. In fact, I think this was a pivotal moment. This was a pivotal moment right here. If there were ever a time when Jesus could have said, no, I think a different path, but it was resolved in these moments right there. And it was settled before he got there, but we're just talking about it in human terms. But I don't know that we can, in human terms, really express what it was that Jesus fully experienced there in the Garden of Gethsemane and the weight that he was feeling. And verse 44 says in Matthew 26, and he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words. He came to his disciples and said, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, here it is, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. At that point, it's resolved, full steam ahead. So Jesus prays in the garden. Second thing I want to talk about is Jesus is betrayed and arrested in the garden. Yes, sir. I don't know. I mean, I imagine there's any number of things of what we could... It could be symbolic of, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinity at work involved in it. I don't really know. What do you think?
Just realize that Peter denied him 3 times.
Yeah.
Here he prays 3 times.
Yeah.
And there was significance in the number, the process. It seemed that if that was seemed to be consistent, that there's a reason for that to be.
And there may very well be. I don't know. I guess probably my first response is why did he pray 3 times? Because he felt like he needed to. I guess that's the only way I could ask. But I'm sure there very well may be some significance in the... I don't know what it is, though. John? Or David? I call you John all the time. I don't know why. You just remind me of John.
As you look at what he said, is there way, your way be done? Your way be done. The second time he goes, is there a way? Is there a way? No. Then the third time, he just says, your will be done. He kind of touch a human anymore. Probably just a touch a human anymore. Like, is there a way to get out of this? Feels the pressure. Like you said, he feels the pressure. He knows it's going to happen. He knows the third time, and then he just really says,
Yeah.
So he doesn't
Yeah.
even ask. So he doesn't even ask. Third time is there a way? Third time is there a way? He just
Yeah, I mean, he comes to the point where I'm
Yeah, I
resolved.
mean, he comes
okay?
to the point where
we're
I'm
making the
resolved,
full turn.
okay?
We're making the full turn. But here's the thing about it. To me, that ought to encourage us. How many of us have wrestled with God in prayer and prayed over something time and time and time again, something that we dreaded, something that we just couldn't wrap our brain around? I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? So it's an encouragement to know, you know what? Jesus experienced some of that too. And I do think a whole lot of it has to do with the fact that some of the humanness on one side, but I also think on the other side of the equation is that him being the Son of God and knowing what's coming when he has made sin and all that's going to transpire there and what that moment is going to be like. I mean, we've all faced, I guess most of us can think of, one or two things that we would say, the most unpleasant moment that I've ever had to face or do something that was really hard or experience something that was just unimaginable. And I think for Jesus, that was the unimaginable. And having to go through it. But thank God he was willing to go through it.
I think it's interesting you say that that brings us comfort, because it makes me think when my wife was going through some real serious illness, one of the things that was strange but that brought her the most comfort was the fact that the Apostle Paul, as great a Christian as he was, there's a passage that says when they were despairing on that ship about to crash, he said that I despaired even as to death. That brought her comfort.
Yeah.
Because here's this greatest Christian who ever lived could despair. She was feeling despair, and it made her feel a oneness with even Paul. So what you're saying really strikes a chord with us.
Well, and I think when you go back and you go back to the words that I was sharing earlier, the first time it talks about he was sorrowful and then distressed, and then sorrowful is used again in the English translation, but in the original language it's a totally different word, okay? One thing what you could probably say is this. You could probably say to some extent, on some level as a human being facing all of this, Jesus was experiencing some sense of despair. And to me, that's one of the things I love about the Scriptures, is that the Bible is just honest. It's out there. It warts and all. It's just the truth. So that when we look at the Pauls and the Moses and Jesus and all that sort of thing, they struggle too. So don't be surprised when you struggle, and don't beat yourself up when you struggle. It's part of the process, Ron.
Even as we're speaking, it's either the simple way we say that we don't understand it, but that Jesus is fully God, fully man. To me, what we're talking about here just gives further evidence of being fully man.
Yes, and we really do most of the time, and we say that, fully God, fully man, but when we're going through and we're studying the Gospels and talking about Jesus, what do we focus on? Well, we focus on the God side, all the miracles and so forth and so on. But maybe it's because it's not until we get to this point in his life that it becomes so obvious, that the humanness becomes so obvious. And so when you get to this stage here, you've got, in the spotlight, both his divinity and his humanness. And yet there's some struggle in that humanness. And there's even some struggle with that divinity. Now, I know that may be something that most of us don't want to, most won't say, but you got to accept there's some truth to that, to some degree. So, as I said, number one, it should make us thankful to God that Jesus did, as David said, that third time, I'm resolved, let's move on, okay? My hour is at hand, let's go do this thing. But yet at the same time, did I call you John again? But at the same time, we also, we see that man, and is that not one of the reasons why Jesus became a man? That listen, the writer of Hebrews says this. He was made perfect through suffering. Now think about that. He said, wait a minute, Jesus, he's already perfect. But what he's talking about, he was made perfect through suffering, primarily in that through his suffering, that's what really qualifies him to be our great high priest. So when we come to him with our struggling, he gets it. He's walked in our shoes. He knows what it is to be a human being down here on this side of eternity in this fallen, dark world, and to face the realities of this dark world and to struggle in the midst of it. But thank God that he gets it, right? And so we don't ever have to be ashamed when we go before the throne of God and we approach our great high priest and we're broken. We're struggling. We're confused. We don't know what to do. But we can go to him and he is going to intercede for us, and the Holy Spirit who lives within us is going to take those groanings that we can't even put into words, and he's going to verbalize them for us before the Father. All that's because what Jesus did. Amen? So the second thing we come to in verses 12 through 14 is that Jesus is, or verses 2 through 14, is Jesus is betrayed and arrested in the garden. We pick up at verse number 2 in John 18, says, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place. Well, how did he know the place, the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, we're told right after that, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this is not the first time Jesus has been to the Garden of Gethsemane with the disciples. And on previous occasions, when Jesus had made his way to the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples, Judas was one of them. And it's kind of interesting to me again. Here we are in this critical moment, and Judas is betraying Jesus, and so he is going to, lead the troops to where Jesus is, and he knew where to go. He knew where Jesus was going to be in this moment. Verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Boy, they put together a posse, They got the posse together. They came out with a show of force to apprehend Jesus. Now here's the question you got to ask. Why did they come with such a show of force to arrest Jesus? Why do you think they came with such a strong force? What are you laughing at, Don?
Not wanting to get real deep, but they were liberals.
Randy, what were you going to say?
I just said that Jesus had a reputation.
I guess they were expecting, Jesus was going to, lead a revolution or something of that nature, I don't. So but they come out with a strong posse, Verse 4, Jesus therefore knowing all things, Jesus therefore knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And here's something that really stands out to me at this moment, is that phrase that says, Jesus went forward. Now to me, that's critical because of what we just finished talking about, Gethsemane, the struggle. But that statement that says, and so here they are now, Jesus, this was part of the struggle. He knew all that was going to happen. Now here it is. It's really starting to come together. Here's the troops coming to get him. And what does Jesus do? He steps forward into God's will. He takes a step forward into his Father's plan. That is such an important thing for us to understand. When God has revealed to us his plan, he's put in our heart what his will and direction is for us, what do? Just take the first step forward. Just step into it and trust God. That's exactly what Jesus did. And so Jesus says, who are you seeking? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. You got the troops here. Verse 7. Then he asked them again, who are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, I've told you, I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. In verse 10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. Now, why do you think Peter cut off Malchus' ear?
He did a bad shot.
Bad shot.
Well, he was probably running his mouth. You know, the guards are there, but he's the high priest's servant. So he's got the fervor that the high priest gave him the orders to do.
Yeah.
So he's probably running off of the mouth, which is about sitting here. And Peter decides to get out of hand. He did grab his sword, swung, and got dead.
But the question is, was Peter aiming for his ear? No. Yeah, he was a fisherman. He wasn't a swordsman.
Why would they specifically name him?
I guess probably the significance that he was the servant of the high priest. And I don't know if we're going to have time to get to that tonight. I'm going to try to get to that part right there. But I think the significance of who was behind all of this. That's the significant piece. See, the reason that he is named is that he is there representing the high priest, who is the one who is behind all of this. Okay? Verse 11, so Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into your sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given to me? And then the detachment of troops and the captain, the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus. They bound him. They led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now you got to listen to that text very closely. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. We saw that back in John chapter 11, verse number 50. But notice who the main player is here, and it's not Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the official high priest, okay? But the power behind the throne is Annas, okay? Annas had formerly officially served as high priest. He was no longer in that role. Caiaphas was in that role. But the real guy holding the power is Annas. Think about it like this. He's the godfather. Really, he's the godfather. All the rest of them, including Caiaphas, who's the official high priest, they're just his minions. This is the guy who holds the real power. In fact, I want you to listen to this. I've quoted from J. Vernon McGee a number of times, but I want you to listen to what he says about this right here. He says, they led Jesus away to Annas first. Only John gives us that detail. And that's the reason why Malchus is mentioned, because he is really doing the bidding of Annas, not Caiaphas, okay?
And Luke says he gets his ear back.
Yeah, he got his ear back on. Luke talks about his ear going back on.
It's a healing, it's a witness for the high priest's servant. So it's going to change his attitude.
Hopefully. You hope. But you know, I don't know, some of these guys are so far gone, you got to wonder if anything changes their heart. But so listen to this right here. So only John gives us that detail, as apparently he was in a position to see something that the others didn't see. Annas had been the high priest and was probably still in the quarters of the palace of the high priest. So in other words, he still had residence in the palace of the high priest. Like I said, he's the godfather, okay? Dr. McGee goes on and says this. Secular history testifies to the fact that Annas was one of the most brilliant, one of the most clever, and one of the most satanic of all high priests. Doesn't that bless your heart? High priest, and yet he's described as being satanic. That is by secular historians that Vernon McGee is quoting. Caiaphas was the one whom the Roman government accepted or recognized as the official high priest, but the real head of the religious group was old Annas. I believe he was the real leader, a politician who knew how to handle Rome. It's my judgment that it was he who plotted the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And I agree 100% that Annas was the guy holding the power. He was calling the shots. He's the one who ultimately orchestrated everything that had transpired and what was going to transpire going forward. Okay? So just remember, when you talk about Annas, just call him the Godfather, because that's what he was. Okay? All right, any questions? Thoughts? We're going to conclude right there. Okay? All right, thank you, and we'll pick up there next week, and I'm going to ask Brother Don to come, and he can lead us in our prayer emphasis tonight.